Hello everyone, thank you very much for inviting me. I will be talking a little bit about the football supporters we saw in the beginning in the video. I actually was quite surprised that there were Stoke supporters in Norway. It's almost as surprising as the fact that there are Stoke supporters in Stoke. What I will be essentially doing in this, in my presentation, is to try to make a connection between issues that people at Fafo work on, essentially issues of labor, labor market, trade unions, and the broad theme of this conference, which is the rise of populism, Brexit, the rise of populist radical right parties. I guess the main argument I will be making in my presentation is that many of the things we've been talking about, the rise of populist radical right parties, come down to one broader trend, which is a change in the political preferences of one specific social group, which used to be the province of both the Social Democrats and trade unions. So that, in many ways, what I will say echoes very much what Øyvind just said about the change in preferences of the working class. This is a graph that also echoes very much what Øyvind just said. On this graph, I've plotted the share of the UKIP vote in the general election in 2015 and the share of routine and semi-routine jobs in English constituencies for the general election 2015. As you can see, there's quite a strong correlation where the share of routine, low-skilled jobs increases in English constituencies, the share of the UKIP vote also increases. So that echoes very much what Øyvind has been saying about the core base of support of both UKIP and Brexit, but I think the correlation here, if we put the data for Brexit, would be quite close, is quite closely related. Now, an even stronger factor that explains also the Brexit vote and support for UKIP is the level of education. On this graph, I've taken the same y-axis, the share of the UKIP vote, but plotted against the share of people with a university education, a university degree in English constituencies. So this is data from the British election study, where the correlation is even stronger. This is data from the British election study that was released a couple of months ago. So we have quite strong evidence when it comes to the Brexit vote, also support for UKIP, that working class people who feel left behind, especially in the north of England, Stoke, for instance, which is the constituency where the new president of UKIP stood, Paul Nuttall, is really the core base of support of UKIP and also populist radical right parties in general. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because this core base of support, the social groups that have turned to the radical right and against the EU, used to be the province of the trade unions and social democratic parties. This is another graph where you can see essentially two broad trends. The first is, which is not very surprising for most of you who have followed this conference so far, is the increase in the electoral share of populist radical right parties. In this graph, I've taken that from the comparative political data set from the University of Bern, where you can see the electoral share of populist radical right and protest parties in 9 European countries. In the 1960s, it was essentially a very marginal phenomenon. You can see them increasing quite steadily, especially from the 1990s and onwards. Now the data is from, so that's data by decade, where you can see that, one, the average level of support for populist radical right parties has increased in general, and also the number of countries that are affected by this phenomenon has also spread quite tremendously. Now there are just, in Western Europe, there's just a handful of countries that don't have a real populist radical right party. That would be Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. Countries like Sweden and Germany were spread for a very long time now. Even now, Germany with the AfD has also a pretty strong electoral challenger, especially for left-wing parties. Now, this is one trend. The second trend is this one. So the kind of social groups that we talked about so far, the blue-collar working class, to use that term, used to be the province of the trade unions. They tended to be quite highly organized, and they tended to vote for the Social Democrats. On this graph, you see two variables. So that's the share of union density. So that's the proportion of workers who are a member of a trade union. The second is the share of these people who voted for Social Democrats, the electoral share of the Social Democrats. The tendencies varies across countries, but you have a very clear declining trend for trade union density. Scandinavian countries are a little bit spared because of essentially the Ghent system, which has tended to keep union density at a higher level. But Social Democrats have been, it's been essentially decreasing pretty much everywhere. Now, two tendencies. How do we know that these two tendencies are related or intersect? With my co-author Lynn Renwald, who's done quite extensive research on the electorate of both social democratic, populist radical right, and center parties, we've done some electoral research that looks at the share of working class people that vote for different party families. So Lynn is a specialist of class voting. This is a graph from her research with Daniel Usch, where you can see essentially a class schema developed by Daniel Usch that differentiates different types of occupations and for which parties they tend to vote. If you have a bar that veers to the right, it means that this social group is more likely to vote for this party family, whereas if it veers to the left, it's less likely. I would like to attract your attention to these two elements in the graph. So that's production workers and service workers, where you can see clearly that these are the two groups, together with small businessmen, that are also the most likely to support populist radical right parties, actually more likely than average than all other groups to vote for the radical right. Whereas the average level of support is about 18% for the whole population, production workers tend to support it by 35%. So that's almost double than average. If you look at the data for the left, and that's what is quite striking if you imagine really the blue-collar working class as being the core base of support of social democrats, nowadays production workers, so people in manufacturing, are actually less likely than average to vote for left parties. So here you can see pretty clearly a quite dramatic reversal in preferences of what used to be really the main group and the main core base of support for left parties in Europe. This is data for Denmark. Denmark is really a bit of a paradise for social scientists because they tend to have data about everything and over a very long period of time. So this is a graph that shows the share of working class voters, so as typified by the class schema that I presented before, in the electorate of both left and social democratic parties in red and populist radical right parties in blue. You've got two trends there. The first is that you can see the red bars diminishing over time. So we have a time series that starts in 1973. It declines quite steadily. What this means is that the share of working class voters within the electorate of left parties has been declining quite steadily to become quite clearly a minority within the electorate of social democratic parties. On the other hand, you've had the blue bars are increasing, which means that the proportion of working class voters within the electorate of radical right parties has been increasing. In general, in the overall population, the share of blue-collar workers tend to diminish, so you have a bit of a bell-shaped curve, but in general, in most European countries, populist radical right parties tend to have a higher proportion of blue-collar workers than social democratic parties. You can see a pretty similar trend in all European countries, with a few exceptions. This is data from France. We have upcoming elections in France, but here again, the Front National has a higher share of blue-collar workers in its electorate than the Socialist Party. This becomes a real challenge for social democratic parties because the electoral survival of social democratic parties basically hinges on their capacity to mobilize new groups of voters. The working class is turning their back on them, so they have to mobilize new types of social groups that tend to be what we would call, what most people in this room, I guess, as you said before, which in the class schema of Usch we would call socio-cultural professionals. Teachers, academics, doctors, healthcare workers, especially people in the public sector. If social democratic parties are not able to do that, they're sort of condemned to the fate of the Dutch Labour Party, which was really went through a quite dramatic electoral defeat in the elections a few days ago, which basically can be explained by its lack of capacity to mobilize these new groups, because they had better alternatives. GroenLinks, that's the Green Party, and D66, which is a kind of a liberal center, liberal pro-EU party, a bit comparable to the Lib Dems in the UK. So basically, the electoral defeat of the Labour Party in the Netherlands can be explained partly by its by its loss of the working class and its incapacity to mobilize these new groups that most other social democratic parties rely on in other countries. Now, one question that one might ask is, if populist radical right parties have become the party of choice for the working class, do they advocate policies that are in line with the preferences of the working class? There is some research, and that's data that I've used for another project based on the comparative manifesto data, where the red lines essentially mean the share of pro-welfare statements in party manifestos, and the blue lines mean the proportion of claims to retrench welfare. So basically, if you've got a lot of red, it means that the party is more pro-welfare, more left. If you've got more blue, it means that it's more anti-welfare. You have a pretty dramatic increase when it comes to France. You can see France in the upper right corner. That essentially changed from a kind of liberal party. For instance, Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 1980s took pride in being called the French Ronald Reagan. Now his daughter is kind of advocating greater spending on healthcare, greater spending on pensions, taxing the rich, and is a very vocal critic of ultra-liberalism in general. So you have some evidence of a shift to the left when it comes to economic issues. Now, there's quite a big difference between what these parties say in their electoral agendas and what they actually do when they are either in government or in parliament. These parties are very critical of EU ultra-liberalism. They defend pension spending. That was, for instance, the case of Geert Wilders before he went to government in 2010, where he said that he would never compromise on one thing, and that was increasing the age of retirement. He did very well in the elections. What he did on the day following the elections is, finally, we don't care about that much, so it's not really a breaking point anymore, and we can still cooperate with the government that wants to increase the retirement age. So there's quite a great deal of difference when you look at what these parties actually do. Oh, here you go. Now, what happens very often, because these parties have to negotiate between the interests of their working class voters and also their traditional electorate, which is small business owners, kind of the traditional electoral base of support of the far right, that tend to be quite anti-tax. So it's quite complex for these parties to really negotiate between these two things, which leads them to betray their working class voters quite often when they come to positions of responsibility, which also entails quite important electoral costs, as the PVV as known in 2012, but also the FPÖ in Austria in 2002. Now, since I have 1 minute left, I think a good way to understand this shift of preferences and this kind of phenomenon whereby the working class has been turning its back on social democracy is there are two types of protection that you can provide to workers. The first is social democracy, which is really the kind of protection that social democrats and trade unions would propose. That's essentially compensating the effects of the market by some level of social protection, more spending, to compensate for the effects of the consequences either of labor market risks, of globalization. The other way whereby you can offer protection is what I would call national protectionism, which is closing borders, closing trade barriers, which is now the big thing that Donald Trump is proposing. This change of preferences can be explained at least partly by the inability of left parties to credibly propose these earlier types of protection to the working class, which has led them to turn to essentially also a way that gives them the impression that they are protected, but via very different political means. Thank you very much.